Engineering and Quality here at Tempur. And today we're going to be doing a demo of the TP trailer tool and the Tempur lock nut system. So before we get into that, I would like to go through some of the components of both the nut and the tool, give you guys some terminology so you know what I'm talking about when we're going through the demo. So this is our lock nut. This is actually the back of the lock nut. This is the back face, and the back face is actually profiled. So we remove some of the material off the back face, and what that does is it opens up the cone of the bearing so that we can actually interface with our tool and push directly on the bearing. On the other side here, we have our dot face. So you can see there's dots going around all the way around the nut. Now each one of these dots correlates with a tooth in our nut, and what that does is we use these dots in the process to line up the teeth with the keyway of the spindle on the truck. So we'll show you that later in the demo. And there's also a groove in here that's a little hard to see, but there's a groove in here that you install the retaining ring into. Line up the teeth with the keyway of the spindle. So here we have the retaining ring. The retaining ring is actually made up of two parts. There's the actual retaining ring, and then there is the key as well. The key has teeth that interface with the nut, as well as a keyway that interfaces with, or a key that interfaces with the keyway on the truck spindle. And once you install this into the nut on the spindle, it locks the nut in so that it can't back off. Okay, and then moving on to the tool, starting at this end, we have our load arms. These are what actually contact the bearing. A little bit further back here we have our load yoke, and then we have a spanner and spacer. The spanner basically just establishes the distance between our load arms so that they properly interface with the bearing. This whole assembly is called our load yoke assembly, and then up front here is our spindle adapter assembly. Now what I'm pointing to is called our keyway locator ring. That helps us establish where the keyway is on the spindle of the truck. And then inside of this keyway locator ring is the spindle adapter. The spindle adapter is what attaches to the spindle of the truck and is basically the anchor for the tool. So we thread that onto the spindle of the truck, and it holds the tool in and provides basically the reaction force needed to apply the load to the bearings. A little further down the line we have the load cell. The load cell is calibrated. We have our gauge, and we have our gauge guard handle. Now the gauge guard handle serves two purposes. It's of course a handle to hold the tool, as well as protecting the gauge. This is what we call our T-handle. The T-handle is what we spin to actually apply the force to the bearings. We have our spindle knob, which is used to attach the tool to the spindle of the truck. And then we have what we call our spindle. It's basically the backbone of the tool, runs through the whole tool and kind of connects everything together. Okay, so I think we're ready to start the process. We have a TP demo stand here, and inside of this hub we have our bearings and everything already assembled. Now the first step is going to be to thread the nut onto the spindle, and then we're going to just use our hand and just kind of till you start making contact. What we're going to do then is make sure everything is seated all the way back. So we're going to grab our bar and socket, and we're going to just make sure that everything's good and snug. Snug it down. And then what we're going to do is back off half a turn. Now that half a turn just makes sure that there is no load on the bearings and that everything is loose, because we want to of course use the tool to set the load. So we just make sure we're backed off. Just kind of hand tighten it until you very first start to touch that bearing. Just get everything as far back as possible. So at this point we can go ahead and grab our tool. Now I like to hold the tool underneath the load cell with one hand and use my other hand to spin the spindle knob, but you can hold the tool up here as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to attach this to the spindle of the truck. Now this is our keyway locator ring, and you can see that we actually have a key on this. We have to get this key into the keyway of the spindle. Now what we've done is we mark that keyway, or that key, with a larger laser engraving. So you can find that large mark, know exactly where the key is, and go ahead and install it to the spindle. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of try and sweep down around the flats of the nut, get the key in the keyway, and then we're going to spin our spindle knob and that attaches the spindle adapter to the spindle of the truck. So now the tool is held by the spindle of the truck. Now, one thing we want to make sure of is that our load arms are in place. They need to be on the front cone of the bearing. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of pull them back until they snap into place right there. And you can see that the load arms are now on the proper location of the bearing. So once we're there, we can go ahead and start applying load to the system. We're going to do that by spinning the T-handle. We're going to start to make contact, and you'll see our needle start to rise. So now we're applying load to the bearings. We're going to go into the roll-in zone. And we like to go to the far end as much as possible without overloading. We don't want to overload the gauge, but we want to be well within the roll-in zone. The reason for that is the next step is going to be to actually roll the hub. And you're going to see that needle is actually going to drop. The reason for that is the bearings are seating themselves out as well as removing any skew. So when we do that, you see that needle drop. Rotate the hub 3 times. And you can see what actually happened was the needle dropped out of the roll-in zone. Now, if that happens, we need to reapply a little bit of load, get back into that roll-in zone, and roll the hub out again. And we need to repeat that process until that needle stays in the roll-in zone, just to make sure we're properly seated out. So you can see now that we're still in the roll-in zone, needle isn't moving anymore, so we're good and rolled in. Bearings are set in place, we're ready to go ahead and get to the set preload that we want. So because this is a TP, it's a trailer, and SAE recommends 500 to 1,000 pounds, we're going to go ahead and drop the load by backing off on our T-handle, and we're going to target that 1,000-pound mark. Okay, so there you see we're right around that 1,000-pound mark. And so the next step is going to be to hand tighten the nut up against the bearing. So all we're going to do is grab this nut and we're going to hand tighten it. And when we make the final setting, we need to make sure that one of the dots on the dot face lines up with one of the hash marks on our keyway locator ring. Now, it doesn't have to be this big mark. It can be any one of these. But what you do want to do is make sure that when you're lining it up, you're looking straight down at the mark. Because if you move side to side, you can get a parallax effect and actually misalign the lock nut, and it's hard to get the retaining ring in. So we want to make sure we're lined up well with the dot. Once we're there, we can go ahead and back the load off of the tool. So we bring this right down to 0. And now there is no more load on the tool. The load is being retained by the lock nut. So that 1,000 pounds that we set on our gauge is now held in place by the lock nut. At this point, we can go ahead and grab the tool, back off the spindle knob. I'm just going to remove the tool from the truck. Go ahead and set the tool down. The next step is going to be to grab the retaining ring and install it into the nut. Now to do that, we're going to sweep this top tab in. Make sure that we engage the teeth, and then we're going to install each one of these tabs with the Easy View notches into that groove and make sure it snaps into place. Now it's important to make sure that you visually check each one of these tabs to make sure that those little Easy View notches are in the groove and that they're all properly installed. Once you've done that, the process is done. So you've now set the SAE recommended preload to your wheel end. It's an easy process. It's a calibrated tool. It's standardized. Nice, quick process. And with that, you get to enjoy the benefits of longer seal life, longer bearing life, tire wear is improved, fuel mileage is gained, and a lot of the problems go away. So that's the end of our demonstration today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was beneficial and that you learned something. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them into the comment section of the Facebook page, and we will be sure to answer them as quickly as we can. Thanks.